Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. So, to begin, Brenda, I know you as a producer. You've worked now on 3 films that have been incredibly critical of governments, critical of individuals that have, kind of, I guess, been very risky for you as an individual and as a producer on Dirty Wars, Citizen4, and now Risk. I wondered whether there's a point where you feel there's too much risk as a producer, whether you're essentially putting yourself on the line.
I'd just like to thank you for mentioning the film title 8 times.
Yeah,
in your question.
It's going to be mentioned a lot, I think.
No, but before we start, I just want to thank you very much for watching this romantic comedy and to Luke Moody, who I've known for many years, and Laura Poitras has known for many years. She sends greetings. She has a family thing this weekend, so she couldn't be here or video in, but thank you, Luke, for dealing with all of our, no, you can't see the film in advance, no, Laura can't come, no. It was always no. So, look, I'll be curious to hear your questions, but I think, the risks in documentary are obviously for the subjects who allow themselves to be filmed, in some cases at with real potential consequences. Obviously, for Edward Snowden and Citizen4, it took some doing for Laura to convince him. And Charlotte will tell us a little bit about her relationship since she was at the beginning of this film, which was 7 years in the making. The same with Dirty Wars. The people who were the subjects of that film they were family members whose families had been killed in the U.S. Drone assassination program. And the same here for Assange and other people at WikiLeaks. It was an incredible risk. It's maybe hard to remember now, but at the time in 2010 and 2011, they were the subject of multi-agency investigations by multiple governments, and they allowed Laura to come in at a time which was incredibly terrifying. So to be able to have a camera person in there at your most intimate moments, I think that's a risk that subjects take all the time. And I think as documentary filmmakers, many of us, right, in this audience, that's the most important thing to keep in mind. But it's true, my legal bills for this film were very, very high, so high. I don't even have to pay them. So many lawyers. But I think that's the reason that we do the work that we do, is because we want to try and bring what truth that we can as filmmakers to the screen. It's not always easy. This particular film has a very complicated history over many years. And so in the end, I don't think that's where the real, even though Laura Poitras was, I think some of you know, has been under investigation. She's actually filed a lawsuit with the Electronic Frontier Foundation to try and retrieve her records, to try and understand why she was detained for more than 50 times at the borders as she came in and out of the country from 2006 to 2012, right? So over 6 years she was detained at the borders, and through a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request, we've learned that was actually connected to her first film about her time in the Iraq War, My Country, her work in Baghdad. It was not actually about other things, but as she says in the film, that surveillance and that detention increased. But I think in the end, look, we're American English filmmakers. We luckily still have some modicum of free speech despite Donald Trump's best efforts. So it's always, I think, the subjects and the people that we work with in the film who are much more vulnerable in the end. As a filmmaker, I would say, never allow yourself to be in a documentary film. It's a crazy idea.
Yeah, we can return to that point of vulnerability and trust between Laura and her subjects. But firstly, I wanted to ask you, Charlotte, I understand you firstly met Julian when you were working at Frontline Club. I wondered how that, firstly, how that relationship was established and how it's been challenged through the making of this film.
Yeah, so, when they first came to Frontline Club, essentially what had happened was the video that Chelsea Manning, the collateral murder, had come out and didn't really have kind of as much of a push and kind of public influence as they'd hoped. And so that was when Julian really stepped forward as the public face of WikiLeaks. And so they started doing much more, well, really wanting to have more press conferences and really engage with the press in a bigger way to hope that the releases would actually gain more momentum. And so they had come to the Frontline Club to do the very first release after that. And just gradually kind of realized that was the place they were going to do that work. And so worked out of our offices for about, I think, a year and a half every day. And so I just, you know, as you would get to know people when you're making tea in a kitchen, you know, you offer people a cup of tea and you get chatting. And so I got to know that team and Julian pretty well over that time because, you know, we were working in the same office every day. And obviously when the first big, I think it was Afghan first, right? Yeah, when the Afghan War Logs press conference happened, every filmmaker I had ever met emailed me, just saying who's doing the film, and you know, just because I was in conversation with them a lot on a day-to-day basis, they had said to me, you know, if we were ever going to do this, who would you think? And I'd said Laura, and I'd never met Laura at that point, but I was a huge fan of her work, and I really felt that seeing it from behind the scenes was really fascinating, especially, you know, seeing the very first day I met Julian, you know, he wasn't famous. And the very second day, he was one of the most famous people on the planet. And it was insane to see that happen to a human being. And just the experience of seeing what they were doing on a day-to-day human level, I had really thought was, you know, this is what people need to see. You know, for good or bad, this is the thing people need to see. You know, they're exactly like all of us, and they just were hoisted into this situation, whether they chose to or some of the team didn't even really realize what was about to happen. And I knew Laura would get that. And that was the kind of thing I wished other people I knew could see so I could explain, you know, talk to them about it, but it was this very close group of people that got to witness the behind the scenes. So that was the film I always thought should be made, and I felt Laura could do it. And so when Laura then reached out and said, you know, I've been trying to get in touch with them, would you help me? I was like, absolutely, of course. You know, you are the absolute perfect person to make the true film about this experience that happened to these people.
And what Laura manages to do, both in, I think, Citizen4 and in this film, is, you know, gain a great amount of trust from her subject. Is there a difficulty that trust means that she has to create some sort of hagiography? And was that an issue with this film where the trust started to perhaps crumble and the differences started to emerge between her wish to create kind of more considered journalism post, I guess, Edward Snowden, and filtering of information as opposed to just, you know, publishing everything?
Yeah, I mean, so the film has a complicated history. Just to give a little bit of it. So as Charlotte was saying, this is 2010, 2011, an eon ago, right? A political eon ago, where Laura and at that point our cinematographer Kirsten Johnson, who's a director as well, started to film in 2011, which is what you see in the opening of the film. And that you know, process of coming under very difficult circumstances and slowly filming and gaining trust is, yeah, it's complicated. And I've worked with Laura now over a few years, and she's incredibly persuasive. I mean, right? Like, she can get you to do anything. Like, she can get you to take the film practically without seeing. I mean, she's very persuasive, and it's a complicated dance. And when I first started, let's fast forward to, we had made Citizen4. She went back to this footage that she had filmed and said that she felt an obligation to return to the film that she had originally was planning on making, which was the third part of a trilogy, which she called the 9/11 trilogy, about trying to understand what had happened with the United States, right? And this was supposed to be the film of kind of taking it home and looking at journalism and leaks. She was filming with Glenn Greenwald, and then Snowden contacted her, and she realized that that film was going to take on a life of its own, and she wouldn't be able to address what she had started with Assange and WikiLeaks. So in 2015, she went back, this is 2 years ago, went back to the footage, and at that point, with the launch of Field Division, the shorts program, they had this idea of a short form series. That was what we started to edit. And at the time, the film was called Asylum, with, you know, focusing on Assange's story of asylum, which, as she says in this film, was, you know, that was what she wanted to make, a film about the journalism and the leaks. And then I got involved in the film, and at a certain point, she said, no, the title isn't Asylum, the title is Risk. And I was like, that's what are you, like, that's such a bad title. You know, I did like the search, you have to do the copyright search. Like there are 8,000 films called Risk and TV, you know, books called Risk. And I was like, we're never gonna get copyright clearance. And I remember the time thinking, like, why did you pick that title? And I think that, as you see here, even more than we understood when we were making the film, is she's trying to not just deal with the risks that Assange and WikiLeaks made, but the themes of betrayal and trust and what it means to very honestly and perhaps with it's quite uncomfortable. I mean, I don't know how you feel, but it was quite uncomfortable for me to be in the edit room, to try to deal with the reality of what that means and the betrayal between subjects and filmmakers. So I think, in a way, she presciently named it that, maybe without even realizing how much that was going to unfold over the process of making the film. So I think it would be dishonest of us to not call that in many of the films that we make. And so you can see that she probably had to deal with that, and we did as a film team much more than we ever anticipated, and that's very difficult, as it has been for WikiLeaks, who are now facing a different set of challenges than they were when even 2 years ago when we first started making the film. So I think it's an attempt here to try and lay bare some of those issues, and only you will be able to say, you know, does it get to that or not? I'll be curious to hear what you think. But yeah, I think that's the heart of the work that we do, is trying to grapple with that honestly. It's not easy.
And the story of Julian is obviously continuing, and you premiered a version of the film at Cannes and have continued to make it, and since the film has completed, there have been further, this fourth case was dropped, or expired rather. How did you choose to end the edit now, and this was the point of exit where you felt like you had, a statement or a narrative?
Well, I mean, I have to tell you, the edit room's open again now, but the
DVD extras.
Yeah, DVD extras. I mean, for the filmmakers in the room, you come to a point where you just sort of say, I've told the truth as much as I can. I've spoken to the moment, and I think I will say with this particular film, we weren't trying to chase the story, right? I hope that we weren't trying to kind of be ambulance chasers. What happened in this film is we took the film to Cannes, and the film was done. Took the film to Cannes not a month ago, but a year and a month ago. And after we released the film, we learned about the stories and allegations about Jacob Appelbaum. That was what brought us back to the edit room, not the story of the election, the US presidential election and WikiLeaks. That was, for us, for reasons that we eventually made plain in the film, raised deep ethical questions for us about, could we bring the film that we had made out into the world? We felt that we couldn't. I remember actually, like a couple weeks ago, sort of saying to our wonderful publicists, some filmmakers may have worked with Ryan Werner, who's worked with many American filmmakers, and I was like, well, it's not that different. I was like, people re-edit all the time after films, right, Ryan? He was like, well, not a year of editing, like not quite that much. So, what was your question? It was like blabbing now.
How you chose this point of exit?
Well, I mean, I think that the story continues, of course, and the story continued, for those of you who remember with Citizen 4, the end of Citizen 4 was literally, the story continues, there are more leakers coming, and the story of WikiLeaks will go on, the questions about press freedom and journalism and what kind of state we're in journalism, but I think we had gotten to the point where we felt like we had told our story. It gets exaggerated a little bit, I would say, by the critics. Like, oh, Laura pulled her film from the premiere. I was like, no, we just decided not to do a press screening. I mean, get over it, right? But is quite dramatic. I mean, when James Comey, then he was FBI director before he'd been fired, is like, WikiLeaks has a cutout. You really can't make that up. We were like, it's gold, it's, film gold. And then obviously when the criminal investigation, the Swedish case, they decided to not pursue it, the film will be shown in broadcast, and we have changed that. But I think that the emotional arc that we went through and that the story we were trying to tell did end in the place, and you just have to stop at a certain point. And I think we felt like we'd gone through the arc of the story to the best that we could, and it will, of course, continue to change. We just hope it doesn't feel, you don't want a film to feel dated. But.
And I guess one question for both of you, and a very kind of producer question, is that how do you deal with these such longitudinal shoots and filming a series of what appear to many non-experts to be non-events, just various conferences or occurrences that you're unsure whether that will be historically significant or contribute to your story in the end, both financially and just in terms of your own career as a producer. How do you stay with a project so long?
It's a credit card and like a lot of narcotics. I think is pretty much. No, I mean, pro tip, right? Well, first of all, I mean, it was in and out, right? We were doing other projects. Laura's the most productive director I've ever worked with. She made tons of short films. She launched Field Division with Charlotte. She has produced many shorts. She's did a art exhibit at the Whitney Museum of Art. She's constantly
and made Citizen 4.
Oh yeah, and Citizen 4, right, in the middle of that. So I mean, there are many other things going on. So you kind of come back, and I will say, since she's not here, I can say whatever I want about her, but the one thing about Laura, and actually Charlotte, you had said this to me too, and we were talking about getting into making this film, she has incredible instincts for timing, right? And it is never done until it's done. And I think in the end, it came at the right time, right? When we are all grappling with news and fake news and what does it mean to be in the era of mass leaks, right? With the possibility of state actors acting in a new way. And so, I think her instincts were completely right about that. I mean, financially, you do what you can, you make it work, you turn down deals because it's not right, and then you eventually find a place, and the film lives as it lives. But it's difficult. But I will say that she would be the first person to use this phrase. She is ruthless in her commitment to trying to get to the point where you can stand by the film, and that in this case meant going back into the edit, for a year. So I don't know. You Charlie, you are the one who's been at this film for the longest. I mean, 7 years you've been in this process.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still in shock that it's even here, to be honest. I get to watch the film. Still, it amazes me. But I think in what you said about her choices, she has this incredible instinct for getting a moment that other people wouldn't see. And certainly when she was filming a lot of the time in London, you'd be like, really, you're going to film that? And then it ends up in the film, whereas things you would assume were slam dunks, she has no interest in. And I think because she knows how to really see, to give you those moments that give you so much insight that other people would perhaps miss. And I think that's such a part of her skill. Because she also, and talking about the trust thing too, the empathy that exudes from Laura just gives you that ease, but it also gets her into spaces and moments that maybe other people don't understand why she's there, and they don't even question them. That's the level of trust that she has, where people just think, well, this doesn't seem like it would maybe make any sense to be in a film, but it becomes a pivotal moment, and I think that really speaks to her filmmaking.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that you always, there are things that you miss. So for example, Sarah Harrison, who when she first started filming, you see in the first film, obviously she had no idea how central Sarah Harrison would become to her own story, going to Hong Kong at great personal risk to herself to bring Laura's source, Edward Snowden, out of really to as it ended up to safety. So I was like, why don't we have more Sarah Harrison in the footage, Laura? And it wasn't, she couldn't have known. And I think that, the wind turned a different direction.
Cool. And I'll just ask one more question before we open it up. So please do put your hands up if you have a question after this. I wondered on a level of kind of aesthetics. In Citizen 4, there was a definite shift towards aesthetics within Laura's filmmaking. And I think this film, maintains some of that, but she's definitely got much more of a personal voice within her film, and I guess a confidence of being recognized as a figure within herself, as a public figure and as a director, and somebody with a voice that an audience can potentially recognize. Was that a choice that you pushed for, or was she kind of moving in that direction as the film became more about her relationship with Julian than a portrait simply of Julian?
Oh no. I mean, we joke in the film team, there was a moment with making of Citizen 4 where Laura was like prone on the couch. There was this couch in the edit suite, and she was like, no, don't make me do it. And we're like, you have to be in the film. I mean, it wasn't just like you didn't just happen to have a camera there. Somebody who was in touch with you, and she's highly, highly, highly resistant to it. I mean, the joke of like the kind of her in the mirror, and then, so to get to the point where she decided to have her voice in this film, it's so prominent, and then which was a very difficult decision to reveal her, the extent of her relationship with Jacob Applebaum, which, I don't know how many of us would be willing to reveal our personal lives in a film that will last forever, and what it takes to do that. That was months and months of aesthetic, discussion. And Luke and I have battled many times over text cards. I had to raise it, right? I don't know, have any of you read Luke's treatise against text cards? Which is like, we're like the queen of, we love text cards in our films. Luke doesn't like text cards. But it's like, come into the edit suite sometime, yeah. But, Luke, but, yeah, that's my role in the film, is like the text cards. So it was a very difficult decision. I think a lot of directors are uncomfortable doing it, but it felt, I think at a certain point it felt disingenuous. So we were saying, well, why, Laura, why didn't you give the Snowden files to WikiLeaks and Assange, right? I mean, that was like a 9-month battle.
I mean, also she was becoming more and more intertwined with the story, even in the fact that a lot of the reason I think that Julian trusted her was the fact that she understood the risk massively, having been detained so much, having, the more work she did, the more risks she was taking and the more threat there was to her safety and her freedom, that I think you can't extrapolate that from the film. You want that perspective, I think, as you watch it. You want to understand where she's coming from too, and the fact that it isn't just a filmmaker, parachuting in and parachuting out, and it's you need that perspective, and I think she kind of started to realize that.
It's also the cinema verite issue, right? I mean, this is the problem with the challenge, right, with observational and cinema verite filmmaking is people will often say, well, can you get an expert opinion in on that? Well, that's not the kinds of films that Laura makes. She makes cinema verite work. She believes in it deeply. So it was a tension, a difficult tension, and we made a decision to bring her voice into it, but it definitely wasn't her idea, I'll tell you that.
Any questions out there? There's one right here.
Yes, it's a very powerful and very, very important film. Thank you for sharing it with us. I'm particularly intrigued by the subplot of Jake Applebaum in that electrifying conference in Cairo, which somehow escaped the news columns here in the UK, and where I thought he was absolutely splendid and was a very important episode in the film. And I'm just intrigued. I don't quite know what's happened to him now after the allegations.
What happened to Jake Applebaum after the allegations?
Oh, right, and you're talking about the Egyptian, right, the scene in Cairo,
Yeah.
which was quite incredible. Actually, Laura has a great line about this. She thought they were going to be arrested. There were, I think we forget now, right, that moment of from January, from the Egyptian uprising, the revolution. This was just a few months afterward, and they were filming, and there were, the police, both undercover and the police were in the conference, and Jacob Applebaum is like really going for it, And I remember Laura like literally said she was like looking around, waiting to kind of be scooped up. As we make clear in the film, those were allegations that were made online, many of them anonymous, some not. There is no criminal investigation. There are no charges. As far as we know, nobody has pressed any charges. So there is no criminal investigation of Jacob Appelbaum, and he lives in Berlin, as he has for many years, since his involvement in the Citizen 4 story. Some of you may remember he was a character also in Citizen 4. And, you know, that's it. As we said, he's no longer working with the Tor project, and it's a complicated situation, but that's where it stands now. But I want to be absolutely clear, no charges have ever been filed, and there is no criminal investigation as far as we know, which is not to say there haven't been consequences.
Any more questions out there? One just here on the left.
Could you talk a little bit more about this idea of power, and how do you see this film as possibly writing the balance of power on who gets to speak about these issues?
I mean, that's a tough question to answer. I mean, I don't know if this is not answering your question, but I hope it isn't. The one thing that I was really struck by watching the film for the first time in its in its final version, like this final, is that often when people talked about Julian, it was this idea that he was this huge egotist. And I think culturally we understand egotism as being very self-centered and very much about yourself and trying to promote yourself in the world. And, you know, there's a different cultural understanding of what egotism means. The thing I think that this film really gets across is the bigger scope of the playing field that he's working on, which isn't necessarily about him. It's how can he still do the work? And I think the element of power that Laura is putting forward is a much more complicated one than perhaps we're used to talking about, which makes a lot of people really uncomfortable, because you're talking about, you know, can you we often, I think, want heroes and villains, and I don't think that any one person is pure or evil, or can be one or the other. And I think, for me, that's the interesting thing about power in this film, is that it isn't simple. And people who look for power aren't always looking in the ways that we think they are, or you know, that's what it is for me. But I don't know if you.
I mean, I'm not sure when you say these issues, which issues do you mean?
So, specifically political power and also the right to information.
So, I mean, I think that WikiLeaks can speak for themselves, and they do in their prolific Twitter account. Certainly, that is the mission, right, of that organization, is absolutely to say secrecy is a form of state power, and free information and a free press, and this source material is a form of exercising in a place of unequal power, a kind of asymmetric warfare. Those are my words, not theirs, but of saying, well, we're going to put the material in front of people, and we're going to build I believe they say an archive, right, a historical archive of material to let the public draw their own conclusions. I mean, I'm interested because I thought you were talking about the issues of power.
And gender power.
Yeah, and gender, right? And who gets to speak, and the threat of censorship, and how that worked. And I think that's what we were trying to illuminate is, who gets to speak and why Laura, how that story changed for her over time. And I think, WikiLeaks isn't thrilled about the film. So it's something that we struggled with a lot. I would say we certainly encouraged her to deal with those issues directly, and she certainly wanted to as well. But it's obviously not easy. It's extremely exposing for her as well as for the subjects. I don't know if that I'm not trying to dodge. I'm not sure if that begins to get at it. But clearly, this is a story also of abuse of power. And I think we're going to see this more and more of people trying to, there are many films here in the festival. I know the American films a little better because I'm American. I think only about myself. But like Whose Streets is a film here that's trying very much to address that question of power as well in the Black Lives Matter movement. So,
and Nobody Speak, not to say
Nobody Speak, right?
Nobody Speak is a very
one.
good example of power,
press power, and how that's being exercised. So. I think it's something that we can only be addressing more and more boldly and more honestly in our politics, in our art, in our creative, endeavors.
Yeah, and I mean on a political level too. I mean, when WikiLeaks started, you've got to remember we had black sites in Guantanamo, and it was very much in the forefront of a lot of things that were legal processes that were being completely ignored. And when you swing so far in one direction, something is going to pop out to counterbalance that for good or bad. So, and maybe WikiLeaks was the antidote in some ways.
We have time for one more question just down at the front here. Yeah, this
one. Hi, thanks so much for sharing the film. I just had a question about Sarah Harrison, really. I thought her storyline and her as a character was kind of one of the most interesting and new things in the film. I just wondered whether Laura did do a kind of sit-down interview with her, or if that was a decision, like she does with Julian in the film, or if it was a decision that she would purely be a kind of a verite character where some of the questions aren't necessarily put to her in that way, or if perhaps she didn't want to be interviewed in that way.
I mean, I think Sarah's role really evolved over time, and certainly, I mean, during the time Laura was filming at that earlier stage where she would have done those interviews with Julian, Sarah was in a very different role, and probably I wouldn't have imagined wanted to have done an interview. I mean, that would be my guess. And then obviously very much came to prominence and became a public figure in her own right, but also, her role very much changed during the Snowden period, of which Laura was making that film. So the two things were she was in very different position and place personally, I think. Yeah,
I mean, look, Sarah Harrison, there could be 5 films made about Sarah, and I really hope, she publishes a book, and I mean, she took an incredible risk, and there's no question about, her bravery and her talent and her brilliance, and, but as Charlotte says, and Charlotte was there at the time, I wasn't, her role evolved, and it's true, Laura doesn't do many sit-down interviews. Even the one with Assange is unusual, as it was with Edward Snowden, right? That was a kind of unusual sit-down. Glenn, grilled him for hours, and Laura was filming. But absolutely, I hope there are more and more stories of Sarah Harrison and other people. There are many more stories to tell about what has happened. I don't know if you had that feeling, but I mean, I'm also very thrilled. Charlotte is exec producing with Laura a film called, I can say now, right? It's out, right? XY Chelsea, about Chelsea Manning. There are many more stories of that as well to tell, and as she's been released, which is a bit of good news. So I say that to say that, yeah, I think there should be more, but it certainly was not a decision at the time to sideline by any means. And I think a good example of this is, again, sort of Citizen 4. These films are all interconnected in a way that Laura wouldn't have anticipated. But you may know that she tried to film in the Moscow airport right after she had to go leave Hong Kong and go back to Berlin for her own protection. After the story came out, Berlin, she continued to try to film and wanted to film, but for a variety of reasons couldn't in Moscow. I mean, believe you me, I've tried to get that surveillance footage out of the Sheremetyevo airport, but maybe RT will make that film one day. But I hope it does get made, and I'm glad that Sarah Harrison has been able to be in the UK. She's back, she's able to be here and continue her work, which is great.
Please put your hands together to thank Brenda and Charlotte for joining us.